It's funny how a single sentence can detonate a decade of your life. June 15th, 2022. I remember the date because it was 2 days after my 20th wedding anniversary, a celebration Mark Sterling, my boss, the CEO of Innovate Solutions, had personally toasted via Zoom just the week before, raising a glass of what looked like expensive champagne. He called me into his glass-walled office, the one overlooking the bustling downtown core we'd finally afforded after the Series C funding round I'd helped secure. The smile he gave me as I sat down was the same confident, slightly predatory grin he used on investors. "Adrian," he began, leaning back, steepling his fingers, "we're making some structural changes as we gear up for the final IPO push. Streamlining. Unfortunately, your role as head of product strategy has become redundant. Redundant. After 10 years. After being employee number 3. After pouring my sweat, my ideas, my late nights, and sacrificed weekends into building this place from a concept sketched on a napkin in a noisy bar into a company valued at nearly $500 million. Redundant. Just like that. The word hung in the air-conditioned chill of the office, obscene in its corporate blandness. He slid a folder across the polished desk. Standard severance. 6 months' pay, a prorated bonus that felt insulting, and the usual non-compete clauses. My stock options, the ones that represented the lion's share of my potential reward, the reason I'd taken a below-market salary for years? They would vest according to the standard schedule, meaning the vast majority, tied to the upcoming IPO liquidity event, would simply evaporate upon termination. He knew that. I knew that. It was the unspoken reason hanging heavier than the redundancy excuse. He was cutting me out cleanly and deliberately just months before the finish line. I felt a strange calm descend, a sort of hyper-focused clarity. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I looked him straight in the eye. "Mark," I said, my voice even, betraying none of the seismic shockwaves ripping through me, "is this decision final?" He nodded, avoiding my gaze now, suddenly interested in a fleck of dust on his monitor. "It is, Adrian. Board approved. HR will walk you through the paperwork. We appreciate your contributions, of course." Appreciate my contributions. The platitude was almost comical. I nodded slowly, picked up the folder, and stood. "All right, Mark. Thank you for letting me know in person." He looked surprised, perhaps relieved that I wasn't making a scene. He probably expected pleading, anger, negotiation. He didn't know me as well as he thought. As I walked out past the teams I'd built, the projects I'd championed, the palpable pre-IPO buzz that now felt like a personal mockery, I didn't feel despair. I felt cold, calculating. Because Mark, in his rush to maximize his own take and perhaps reward newer, shinier executives, had forgotten about a dusty addendum to my original offer letter. An addendum drafted hastily back in 2012, long before lawyers scrubbed everything clean, long before Series A, B, or C. An addendum containing a clause about founder-level equity, a specific percentage grant tied not to vesting schedules but to my foundational role in the company's core IP. An ownership clause. And I had my original signed copy, safe and sound. He hadn't just made me redundant, he'd armed me. Building Innovate Solutions wasn't just a job, it was practically raising a child. I joined Mark and our CTO, Ben Carter, back in late 2012. Mark was the smooth-talking salesman, Ben was the coding prodigy, and I, Adrian Miller, then 42, was the supposed grown-up, the one with industry experience, a strategic mind, and a knack for turning Ben's brilliant but chaotic code into something resembling a marketable product. We operated out of a cramped, shared office space that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and desperation. My wife, Clara, bless her soul, had been hesitant. Leaving a stable, senior position at a large corporation for a pipe dream with 2 guys barely out of their 20s? It sounded insane. But I saw the potential in Ben's core algorithm, and Mark could sell sand in the Sahara. The pay was laughable, a third of my previous salary. That's where the equity conversation came in. Mark, eager to lock me in without spending precious cash, scribbled an amendment onto my bare-bones offer letter. It wasn't standard options, it was cruder, more direct. It stipulated that in recognition of my foundational contribution to the company's initial product architecture and market strategy, I was granted a 1.5% stake in the company's common stock, separate from any future option grants vesting immediately upon signing. It was signed by Mark, dated October 5, 2012. I made sure I got a copy of that signed letter before filing the original. In those early days, 1.5% of nothing felt like slightly more than nothing, a lottery ticket. But I wasn't betting on the lottery, I was betting on us. For the next 10 years, I poured everything into Innovate. I architected the first 3 generations of our flagship SaaS platform, navigated complex customer requirements, built the entire product management team from scratch. I was the bridge between Ben's technical genius and Mark's market ambitions. When venture capitalists circled, I was the one who could articulate the long-term vision and the product roadmap, translating geek speak into dollar signs. I remember the all-nighters before the Series A pitch, fueled by stale pizza and adrenaline. I remember negotiating crucial partnership deals that put us on the map. I remember mentoring junior employees, celebrating team wins with cheap beer and karaoke, mediating disputes between departments. Clara and I put off vacations, dipped into savings during lean months, structured our lives around the company's relentless demands. My kids grew up seeing their dad hunched over a laptop at the kitchen table most evenings. It wasn't just about the potential payout anymore, it was about the shared dream, the camaraderie, the pride in building something meaningful. Mark often called me his consigliere, his right hand. He leaned on my judgment, especially in the early years. We weren't just colleagues, I thought we were friends. We'd shared beers lamenting bad hires, celebrated funding rounds like victorious generals, even attended each other's family events. Ben, bless his introverted soul, mostly kept to the code, but Mark and I were the public faces, the strategy duo. I never rocked the boat, never made unreasonable demands. I trusted the process. I trusted Mark. The standard stock options came later, with formal vesting schedules, cliffs, and strike prices as the company matured and proper HR structures were put in place. They were substantial, sure, but that initial 1.5% grant, tucked away in my files, represented something different: sweat equity earned in the trenches, a founder's promise. It was easy to see how, 10 years later, amidst multi-million-dollar valuations and complex cap tables managed by expensive law firms, such an old, simple agreement might be overlooked or conveniently forgotten. The first little tremor of unease started about 8 months before the firing, maybe around October 2021. We just secured the massive Series C round, the one that paved the way for the IPO. Suddenly, there were new faces everywhere: sleek, expensive consultants, investment bankers, a new chief financial officer, Amelia Hayes, brought in specifically for the IPO process. The scrappy, familial vibe began to erode, replaced by a more corporate, cutthroat atmosphere. Mark, who once brainstormed with me over whiteboard sessions, became harder to pin down. Meetings were increasingly formal, often delegated to newer VPs. My input, once sought on nearly every major decision, seemed less critical. I first chalked it up to the immense pressure of the IPO preparations. Mark was juggling bankers, lawyers, potential institutional investors. His focus was understandably shifting. But then came the subtle exclusions. Strategic planning meetings I should have been central to were happening without me. Decisions about product direction, my core domain, were being made by Mark and the new CFO, sometimes looping in junior product managers I'd hired, but bypassing me. I'd hear about them secondhand. When I tried to address it directly with Mark, citing a specific instance where a roadmap decision contradicted months of my team's research, he waved it off. Just moving fast, Adrian, he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder with that practiced bonhomie. Need to be agile for the markets. Trust me, it's all aligned with the big picture. But the rationale felt thin. Around February 2022, Sarah Jenkins, the head of HR Mark had hired 2 years prior, started having overly structured check-ins with me. She used corporate jargon like synergy mapping and future-proofing roles. It felt like she was building a case, documenting perceived misalignments that weren't actually there. I'd counter her vague points with specific examples of my team's successes and my strategic contributions, but she'd just nod politely and type notes into her laptop. Emails became trickier. I noticed Mark CC Sarah on communications that previously would have just been between him, Ben, and me. Requests for data or project updates that used to be informal chats became formal email chains meticulously documented. Then there was the incident with the quarterly projections. My team had prepared a realistic, data-backed forecast. Mark and Amelia, the CFO, presented significantly more aggressive numbers to the board pre-IPO committee, numbers I felt were unsustainable and potentially misleading. When I raised concerns privately with Mark, showing him my team's analysis, he became defensive. "We need to show ambition, Adrian. This is the big league now. Don't be overly conservative." That was a red flag flapping violently in my face. Mark, who had always valued my pragmatism, was suddenly prioritizing optics over reality. The final, chilling signal came about a month before the end in May 2022. There was an off-site meeting for the C-suite and key VPs to finalize the S-1 filing details, the formal IPO registration document. I wasn't invited. My role, head of product strategy, was fundamental to the company's story and future projections outlined in that document. Ben Carter, the CTO, seemed uncomfortable about it. He mumbled something about Mark wanting a streamlined group focused purely on the financials and legal aspects. Ben wasn't confrontational, but his discomfort told me volumes. I started quietly reviewing my files at home, digging out that original offer letter and the signed addendum from 2012. I made multiple secure digital copies. I reread the standard stock option agreements. The language was clear: termination without cause before the IPO meant most of my options wouldn't vest. But the addendum was different. It spoke of a direct grant, not options subject to vesting tied to time or a liquidity event. It was basic, almost primitive compared to later documents, but it was signed, dated, and unambiguous. My suspicions solidified into certainty. Mark, likely advised by Amelia and facilitated by Sarah, was planning to cut me loose to tidy up the cap table, maximize the available pool for newer executives, and perhaps reclaim that 1.5% common stock for himself or key allies before the company went public. My loyalty, my history, my contributions, they were being written off as sunk costs. The upcoming IPO wasn't a shared victory, it was the deadline for my betrayal. The meeting on June 15th was short, brutally efficient. Mark delivered the news, Sarah Jenkins hovered nearby with the severance package, and security personnel, previously unseen on our floor, waited discreetly by the elevator bank. It was clinically executed. They had me escorted out immediately after the meeting, citing standard procedure for departing executives. I wasn't even allowed back to my desk to collect personal items. HR promised to pack them and courier them over. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a cold knot in my stomach. Walking out of that building for the last time, carrying only the severance folder Mark had handed me, felt surreal. 10 years erased in 10 minutes. Back home, Clara was shocked, then furious. She wanted to storm down there, give Mark a piece of her mind. I urged calm. Anger wouldn't help, strategy would. The first thing I did that very evening was contact Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a sharp, no-nonsense employment lawyer I'd known socially for years. We weren't close friends, but I respected her intellect and tenacity. I emailed her scanned copies of my original offer letter, the signed 2012 addendum granting the 1.5% common stock, my standard stock option agreements, and a summary of the termination circumstances. Her reply came the next morning: "Adrian, this addendum is interesting. Unconventional for later-stage startups, but potentially ironclad, especially given the date and context. Let's meet ASAP. We met 2 days later in her discreet office. Eleanor reviewed everything meticulously. She explained that while my standard options were likely lost due to the termination without cause timing relative to the IPO, a common, albeit harsh, practice, the 2012 addendum was a different beast. It wasn't an option grant, it read as a direct equity grant vesting immediately upon signing back in 2012. It represented actual ownership, not just the right to buy shares later. They probably either forgot about this entirely, Eleanor theorized, tapping the addendum, or assumed it was superseded by the later, more formal option plans. Or perhaps they thought you'd lost your copy or wouldn't dare challenge them so close to the IPO. We discussed strategy. A lawsuit would be lengthy, expensive, and potentially jeopardize the IPO timing, which might paradoxically reduce the value of my own stake if I won. Eleanor suggested a more surgical approach. We don't go nuclear immediately, she advised. We wait until they've publicly filed the S-1 registration statement. That document has to be accurate, detailing the company's capitalization structure, major shareholders, and potential risks. Once it's filed, we send a formal demand letter to Mark, the board, and their securities counsel pointing out the material omission of your 1.5% common stock ownership as detailed in the 2012 agreement. Failure to accurately represent the cap table in an S-1 filing is a serious securities violation. It could delay or even derail the IPO. The beauty of it was its precision. It wasn't just about getting my money, it was about leveraging the legal and regulatory pressure points of the IPO process itself. Mark's rush to cut me out cleanly would become his procedural nightmare. Over the next few weeks, I laid low. I signed the basic severance agreement after Eleanor confirmed it didn't waive any pre-existing equity rights, a crucial detail. I took the 6 months' pay, it would cover expenses while we waited. I meticulously documented everything I could remember, dates of key contributions, specific projects I led, instances where Mark had acknowledged my foundational role, the suspicious behavior leading up to the termination. I resisted the urge to lash out publicly or contact former colleagues. Silence was my ally. The hardest part was the waiting, watching Innovate Solutions march towards its public debut. Friends texted congratulations, unaware I was no longer part of it. Industry news sites buzzed about the upcoming flotation. It felt like watching your own ship sail away while you were stranded on a desolate beach. But every time doubt or bitterness crept in, I looked at the copy of that 2012 addendum. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was proof. It was leverage. It was justice waiting for its moment. On August 28, 2022, Innovate Solutions publicly filed its S-1 with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I downloaded it the moment it became available online. As Eleanor and I had suspected, the capitalization table made no mention of my 1.5% common stock grant. My name was listed only in the context of departed executives, my unvested options noted as forfeited. They had erased me from the ownership structure. The next morning, Eleanor Vance sent the demand letter via certified mail and email to Mark Sterling, every member of the board of directors and the lead underwriters council listed in the S-1. The game was now officially afoot. The reaction was swift, though initially indirect. Within 48 hours of the demand letter being delivered, Eleanor received a call not from Mark, but from Innovate's high-powered securities lawyer, a man named Richard Carlisle from a top-tier firm. His tone was initially dismissive, attempting to brush off the 2012 addendum as an informal early discussion or something clearly superseded by subsequent, formal stock option plans. Eleanor, cool as ever, simply held her ground. She pointed out the document's explicit language, the signatures, the date predating any formal option plans, and the lack of any subsequent agreement explicitly rescinding or modifying that specific grant. Mr. Carlisle, she stated calmly, your client has filed an S-1 document with the SEC that contains a material misrepresentation of its capitalization structure. My client, Adrian Miller, holds 1.5% of the common stock granted in 2012 and vested at that time. This is not reflected in the filing. We expect you to file an amended S-1 correcting this omission immediately. Failure to do so will compel us to inform the SEC directly of this deficiency. The threat of involving the SEC directly, especially after the S-1 was filed, was potent. An SEC inquiry could halt the IPO process indefinitely, invite intense scrutiny, and potentially lead to penalties. Carlyle's confident tone faltered slightly. He asked for copies of the documentation, which Eleanor promptly provided, highlighting the crucial clauses. Silence followed for nearly a week. It was a nerve-wracking time. I imagined frantic meetings happening within Innovate's boardroom and lawyers' offices. They were likely scrambling, reviewing old files, trying to find a loophole. On September 9th, Carlyle called Eleanor again. This time, his tone was markedly different, pragmatic, bordering on conciliatory. He acknowledged the existence of the signed addendum but tried to negotiate its interpretation, perhaps arguing it should be valued differently or subject to repurchase rights. Eleanor didn't budge on the ownership percentage. The grant is for 1.5% of common stock, Mr. Carlyle. Not options, not restricted units, common stock. My client is a beneficial owner, and the S-1 must reflect that. Carlyle eventually conceded the core point but pivoted to finding a resolution that wouldn't derail the IPO, which was now entering its crucial roadshow phase where Mark and his team pitched the company to institutional investors. A public fight or a delayed IPO would be disastrous for them. He proposed a settlement. Innovate would fully acknowledge my 1.5% ownership stake, but instead of issuing the shares directly pre-IPO, which could complicate the offering, they would pay me the cash equivalent based on the final IPO price, immediately upon closing. Furthermore, they offered a significant premium on top of the calculated value, contingent on signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a release of all claims. Eleanor negotiated hard. We weren't just after the cash value, we wanted acknowledgement and compensation for the breach of trust and the attempted erasure. We pushed back on the initial premium offer. We also insisted the settlement acknowledge the validity of the 2012 grant explicitly. Finally, on September 20, 2022, we reached an agreement. Innovate Solutions would pay me a sum calculated as 1.5% of the company's valuation at the IPO price, plus an additional multi-million-dollar figure as settlement for all claims. The total amount was staggering, far more than my unvested options would have ever yielded even post-IPO. It represented life-changing money. Crucially, the settlement agreement contained language explicitly confirming the legitimacy of the 2012 equity grant. They had to admit on paper that I was right. They also had to file an amendment to the S-1, not detailing my settlement thanks to the NDA, but subtly adjusting the overall share counts and risk factors to account for outstanding obligations. Satisfying regulatory requirements without airing the dirty laundry too publicly. It was a masterful piece of legal maneuvering by Eleanor. I never spoke to Mark Sterling again directly through this process. It was all handled through lawyers. I saw him quoted in the financial press, talking about Innovate's bright future, looking forward to ringing the opening bell. There was no public fallout for him personally. But I knew and he knew that his attempt to cut me out had backfired spectacularly. He tried to save the company and himself a few million by discarding me and ended up paying out significantly more under duress just weeks before his crowning achievement. The quiet satisfaction of that was immense. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, no public shaming, no corporate implosion. It was cleaner, colder. It was the enforcement of a forgotten promise, a legal checkmate executed calmly and decisively. The wire transfer hit my account 3 days after Innovate Solutions successfully completed its IPO in November 2022. Seeing that number, the result of enforcing that decade-old clause, wasn't just vindication, it was liberation. The money didn't erase the betrayal, of course. The sting of being discarded after a decade of loyalty by someone I considered a friend remains. You can't put a price on that kind of disillusionment. But the settlement provided something equally valuable: freedom and closure. It allowed Clara and me to breathe, to step off the relentless treadmill I'd been on for so long. We paid off our mortgage, set up substantial college funds for our children, and invested prudently. The financial security was profound, lifting a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. More importantly, it gave me options. I didn't need to jump back into the high-pressure tech world immediately. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. For the first time in my adult life, my next step wasn't dictated by financial necessity or career ambition. I took 6 months off completely. We traveled, not extravagant luxury trips, but meaningful ones. We visited national parks I'd only seen in photos, spent extended time with family we'd neglected during the startup years, reconnected with old friends. Clara and I rediscovered hobbies we'd let slide. I started woodworking, finding immense satisfaction in shaping raw timber into something tangible and useful, a welcome contrast to the often ephemeral world of software. I also spent time reflecting. Was Mark always planning this, or did the pressure and greed of the IPO corrupt him? Did Sarah Jenkins and Amelia Hayes manipulate him, or were they willing accomplices? I suspect it was a confluence of factors: opportunity, perceived expediency, and a callous disregard for loyalty when large sums of money were on the line. It's a depressingly common story in the startup world, I suppose. Mine just had an unusual contractual twist. Eventually, the itch to build something returned, but on my own terms. I didn't want to climb another corporate ladder or chase another billion-dollar valuation. Instead, I started consulting part-time, helping early-stage founders navigate the product strategy challenges I knew so well. I focused on mentoring, offering the kind of guidance and ethical grounding I wish I'd had more of. I also invested modestly in a couple of small, mission-driven startups run by people who seemed genuinely passionate about solving real problems, not just flipping companies for a quick buck. My stake in Innovate Solutions, secured through the settlement, became purely financial. I sold the shares gradually after the lockup period expired, diversifying my investments. I don't track the company's day-to-day progress anymore. It represents a closed chapter. Looking back now, almost 3 years later, the betrayal by Mark still feels like a scar. But scars fade, and they remind you of lessons learned. I learned that loyalty is not always reciprocated, especially when significant money is involved. I learned the crucial importance of understanding every word in a contract, no matter how old or seemingly insignificant. And I learned that calm, strategic action, grounded in facts and legal rights, can be far more powerful than emotional reactions. The experience changed me. I'm more cautious now, perhaps a bit more cynical about corporate rhetoric. But I'm also more appreciative of genuine relationships, personal integrity, and the freedom to define success on my own terms. Mark Sterling got his IPO, his moment of glory on the stock exchange floor. But I got my justice, my peace of mind, and a new beginning. And in the quiet satisfaction of that outcome, I found my own, more lasting victory.